What is a life worth when the world insists it belongs to another? The question echoed in Abeni's mind each morning, though she dared never speak it. Dawn had barely broken, and already the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and iron. The chain around her ankle clinked as she shifted on the rough wooden floor of the slave cabin. The sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. Shackles had been her cradle, her bed, her waking song. Abeni's wrists burned from the rusted cuffs she had worn all night. Her breath came slow and steady, but her eyes betrayed a fire, a defiance carefully hidden behind lowered lashes. She knew better than to let that fire show. Overseers had a way of spotting even the faintest spark, and when they did, the whip fell harder. The door burst open, and cold morning air rushed in with Harlan the overseer. He barked orders like a rabid dog, his whip coiled loosely at his side. Up, move, you cattle, his voice cut through the half-light. Mothers clutched their children, elders groaned as they rose, and bodies shuffled toward the fields. Abeni stood, her frame tall, despite the hunger hollowing her stomach. Despite the ache in her bones, outside the sun was just climbing the horizon, spilling gold across the endless rows of cotton. For others, dawn might have meant hope. For Abeni, dawn was a sentence, another day of toil, sweat, silent screams swallowed into the dirt. She bent to lift the heavy sack slung over her shoulder, the coarse fabric rubbing her skin raw. Around her, the other slaves moved in quiet rhythm, their eyes downcast, their spirits shackled as surely as their bodies. Yet when Abeni's gaze flickered upward, she caught sight of the sky, vast, endless, untouched by whip or chain. For the briefest heartbeat, she let herself imagine freedom. Then came the crack of the whip, splitting the morning air. A man cried out in pain somewhere down the row. Abeni flinched, but forced her hands steady. She had learned long ago, tears. Feed them, silence starves them. But deep inside, beneath the scars, beneath the hunger, beneath the chains, Abeni clung to something fierce and unbroken. They could shackle her body. They could strip her dignity. But they would never erase her fire. Asterisk, the sun climbed high, dragging the day into a blistering furnace. Abeni's shoulders screamed beneath the weight of the cotton sack, its coarse fibers scraping her skin until blood mingled with sweat. Fields stretched endless, white bowls gleaming like teeth under the harsh light. Every step, every stoop, every pluck carried pain. But slowing down was never an option. Harlan prowled the rows like a wolf. His shadow fell over the slaves, long and sharp, and every back straightened instinctively at his presence. He lived for fear, feeding on the silence he created. Waiting for the moment someone faltered, Abeni's fingers trembled as she reached for another bowl. Her knuckles cracked open from work. The sack dragged at her spine, but she forced her pace steady. She had seen what happened when bodies betrayed them, when fatigue became visible. Not far away, a young boy stumbled, his small frame crumpling into the dirt. Alun's eyes snapped. Toward him, and in an instant, the whip unfurled like a snake. It hissed through the air and struck, tearing the boy's shirt and skin alike. His cry echoed down the rows. "Faster," Harlan snarled. "You'll work or you'll bleed." The boy's mother reached instinctively, but Abeni saw her hesitate, her arms freezing in midair. To move, to comfort, to protest any of it, could mean death. She stayed rooted, her face streaked with tears. While the boy's small body writhed under the whip's bite, Abeni turned her face back to the cotton, her vision blurring. Rage boiled in her chest, but she swallowed it, pressing her lips into a thin line. She could not save him. She could not even save herself. Survival demanded silence, demanded swallowing every scream until it turned to stone inside her ribs. Hours dragged by, the heat scorching, the whip always ready. When Abeni's sack was finally deemed full enough, she staggered beneath its weight to the scales, her breath ragged. Harlan's eyes landed on her, and for a moment she thought she saw suspicion in his gaze. His whip tapped lazily against his thigh. "You move slower than you should, girl," he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to meet his eyes with lowered lids, head bowed. "Yes, sir," she whispered, voice flat. Silence lingered, then the lash cracked. Pain lanced across her back, white-hot, cutting through her flesh. She bit down hard on her tongue to smother the cry that clawed at her throat. Blood welled, soaking into her dress. Harlan smiled at her silence, mistaking it for obedience. Good, he spat. Remember your place? She staggered back to her row, every step burning. The whip had left her body bleeding, but her silence, her refusal to give him the satisfaction of hearing her scream, was the only resistance she could afford. Inside, a voice repeated over and over, I am more than what they see. I am more than what they break. And with each repetition, her fire refused to die. The fields gave no rest, but the summons to the big house was its own kind of torment. When Ebony heard her name barked by one of the house servants that evening, her stomach tightened. She wiped dirt and blood from her hands, though nothing could cleanse the deep cracks in her skin. Inside, air was heavy with the scent of roasted meat and candle wax. The big house was a world apart, polished wood, velvet drapes, and portraits of pale ancestors staring down with hollow eyes. Ebony's bare feet sank into rugs that her hands would never be allowed to touch as anything but a slave. Judge Whitfield sat at the head of the long table, his heavy frame commanding the room. He did not need to raise his voice. His silence alone carried menace. Ebony stood near the wall, waiting, always waiting, till he gestured for her to step forward and refill his glass. His eyes lingered. They always lingered. Not on the glass, not on the wine, on her. The gaze crawled over her skin like invisible chains. You're stronger than most, he drawled, his voice slow, deliberate. That's why you last. Some don't. He sipped, watching her with a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. But strength in a slave, it's dangerous. It makes me wonder where to cut. Ebony kept her head lowered. Silence was the only answer. Any word would be twisted. Any sound might ignite his cruelty. Across the table, Mistress Whitfield's face twisted with venom. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass, burned into Ebony with jealousy and contempt. She leaned closer to her husband. Let them forget themselves when you give them notice, she hissed. That one needs breaking or selling. The judge waved a hand dismissively. She's useful, too useful. Mistress Whitfield's lips curled. Her cruelty, unlike her husband's, was not lustful, but cold, sharpened by bitterness. Later that night, when Ebony carried dishes to the kitchen, the mistress cornered her near the door. You think your skin makes you something special? She whispered harshly, her nails digging into Ebony's arm. You are nothing. The sting of those words followed her out of the big house, deeper than any lash. She walked back to the quarters with her body intact, but her spirit trembling. The eyes of the master haunted her like chains, the spite of the mistress like salt on her wounds. Yet when she lay down on the hard floor of the cabin, among the breaths and coughs of her people, she stared into the dark and forced her heart. To steady, the judge could own her labor. The mistress could spew her venom. But her soul remained hers. She closed her eyes, whispering silently to herself, They will not erase me, erase me. Night wrapped itself around the quarters like a heavy cloak, yet inside the cabins, sleep was a stranger. The day's bruises lingered on every back, the overseer's shouts echoing even in silence. Hunger gnawed, wounds burned, but what hurt most was the weight of despair that settled deeper each passing season. Ebony sat cross-legged, near the dim glow of a dying candle stub. Beside her, Ezekiel's breaths rattled, shallow and uneven. Every sound from his chest reminded her of time, slipping away. Around them, children whimpered in their sleep, and mothers held them tighter, as if their arms could shield them from the cruelty of dawn. It was in that stillness that Maya, a young woman close to Ebony's age, leaned over and pressed a small piece of bread into her palm. Eat, she whispered. Ebony stared at it. The crust was rough. Hardly more than a scrap, but her stomach twisted with need. Where I saved it, Maya cut in quickly, her eyes darting to the door as if Harlan himself might burst. In. I couldn't let you starve worse than you already do. Ebony's throat tightened. Words of thanks felt dangerous, so she only nodded, breaking the bread in half and pushing a piece back toward Maya. For a moment, the two women shared. Silence, chewing slowly. Their eyes saying what their lips dared not. We keep each other alive. Later, when the candle burned out and the room sank into shadows, a hum drifted through the air. Faint at first, then stronger. A tune Ebony recognized, old as the earth itself. Maya was singing softly, the notes like a thread pulling them all closer together. The melody wrapped around the cabin, around their wounds, around their grief. Others joined, barely above a whisper.
Ow.
It wasn't loud enough to be heard outside, not loud enough to risk the whip. But within those walls, the song grew a secret. Flame, a rebellion no overseer could stamp out. Ebony closed her eyes, letting the rhythm seep into her chest. For the first time in days, she felt warmth that was not the sun's cruelty. She thought of her mother long gone, whose voice once carried the same tones. She thought of freedom not as a place, but as a memory that lived inside every note. The song ended as quickly as it began, swallowed by the fear of discovery. The silence that followed was heavier, but it was not empty. It was full of defiance. The next day, though, the cost of even small joy became clear. A young boy, no older than 10, absent-mindedly hummed the same melody while bent in the field. Harlan heard it. He yanked the boy up by the arm, whip unfurling. "You think you're free to sing?" he snarled. The lash struck again and again, cutting into small limbs until the boy's cries filled the fields. Ebony kept her head bowed, tears burning in her eyes. Rage clawed at her chest, but she swallowed it down, her lips pressed shut. That night, she held Maya's hand in the dark. Both women silent, but united by grief and fire. In the cruelty of the overseer's whip, in the blood on the earth, they saw the truth. Every smile, every scrap of bread, every whispered song was resistance, and resistance, no matter how small, was a flame in the darkness. Asterisk, the summons came on a night when the air was thick with heat, heavy enough to choke the lungs. Ebony had been trying to soothe Ezekiel, who now barely stirred even when touched. His breaths rattled like leaves in the wind, his body more spirit than flesh. She wanted to stay by his side, to give him what little comfort she could, but when the call came from the big house, there was no refusing it. She walked barefoot across the yard, the gravel biting into her skin. The mansion loomed like a beast against the dark sky, its windows glowing with lamplight. She felt the weight of eyes on her before she even entered. Inside, Judge Whitfield waited. His bulk slouched in the chair, his drink in hand, his gaze sharp. "Come here, girl." The words carried no room for hesitation. Ebony stepped forward, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might betray her fear. Whitfield rose slowly, circling her the way a man inspects livestock. His hand grazed her shoulder, sliding down her arm, pausing on her wrists where the iron cuffs had left permanent scars. "Strong," he murmured. "Too strong to be wasted." She stood still, her breath shallow. She had endured this gaze before, this lingering hunger disguised as ownership. But tonight, something had shifted. There was no one else in the room. No witnesses, no Mistress Whitfield, to temper her husband's impulses with jealous rage. Tonight, Ebony was cornered prey. When his hand moved lower, she stiffened. Her mind screamed, but her body obeyed the unspoken law. Stillness was survival. Resistance would not save her. It would only give him reason to destroy her further. The cruelty came not just in touch, but in the way he spoke, reducing her to nothing, stripping her of humanity. Every word a chain, every breath a reminder that her body was not hers. Hours passed in silence, broken only by his commands. When it was over, he dismissed her with a wave, as if she were less than the dust. Beneath his boots, Ebony staggered out into the night. Her dress torn, her body burning with shame that was not hers to bear. The cool air hit her skin, but she felt no relief. She walked the path back to the quarters, each step heavier than the last. Inside, Maya was waiting. One look was all it took. Maya saw the truth written in Abini's eyes, in the way her hands shook, in the blood staining the hem of her dress. Without a word, she pulled Abeni close, cradling her like a sister. Rocking her gently, as if to stitch back the pieces of her broken body. For the first time in years, Abeni allowed herself to weep, not quietly, not swallowed, but openly in the arms of someone who knew the same suffering. Her sobs tore through the silence, raw and jagged, and still Maya held her. When the tears finally slowed, Abeni lay staring at the ceiling, her body hollow, but her soul whispering defiance. Whitfield could command her flesh, he could scar her skin. But he could not kill the memory of freedom carried in her blood, and though she felt like ash, she swore to herself, fire can be born again, even from ash. The days after that night felt heavier than chains. Abeni moved through the fields like a shadow, her body aching, her spirit raw. Yet inside her chest, something dangerous had begun to stir, a rage that no whip could silence. Ezekiel's death came quietly, almost mercifully, under the cover of night. His final breath slipped from his chest as Abeni sat beside him, holding his hand. She felt the life leave him, leaving only the shell of a man who had carried so many others with his strength. No overseer knew of his passing yet, and the slaves worked in silence to bury him in a shallow grave beyond the quarters. They dug with bare hands, the earth cold and unyielding, their tears mixing with soil. Abeni stood at the edge of the grave, her voice trembling as she whispered, "They cannot bury what you taught us." No songs were sung aloud, it was too dangerous, but grief hung in the air like a hymn unspoken. Something broke that night, and something else was born. The whispers began in secret, passed like sparks in the dark. We cannot live this way forever. Slaves gathered in hushed corners, speaking of tools hidden away, of roots through the woods, of courage borrowed from rage. Abeni listened, her heart torn. She knew the cost of rebellion. She had seen the overseer's fury, the way blood soaked the earth when even small disobedience was found. But still, she found herself thinking, what is life if it belongs to another? One evening, a small group tried. They slipped from the quarters, running for the tree line, their feet pounding against the earth like drums of freedom. For a fleeting hour, hope swelled in the air. Then came the dogs. The overseers hunted with teeth and chains. Abeni heard the cries when they were dragged back, beaten until their screams grew hoarse, their bodies unrecognizable. The smell of blood filled the yard. Harlan stood grinning as the others were forced to watch, his whip cutting across flesh until silence fell again, a silence full of fear. Abeni's fists clenched at her sides, nails cutting into her palms. She could not move. She could not speak. All she could do was burn inside, her fury pressed tight behind her ribs. That night, when she lay in the cabin with Maya, her voice came out hoarse. Barely more than a whisper, "I cannot die like this. I will not." Maya's hand found hers in the dark. "Then we hold on," she whispered back. "We hold on until we cannot any more." In the fields, in the cabins, in the graves dug by their own hands, blood soaked the earth. But within that soil, defiance rooted itself. And though terror reigned, the dream of freedom still flickered, fragile but alive. Asterisk. Asterisk. The punishment came without warning. At dawn, Abeni was pulled from the line of slaves headed for the fields. Harlan's hand gripped her arm like iron, dragging her through the dirt until she stood before Judge Whitfield. His face was red with fury, his voice sharp with accusation. "They say you helped the runaways," he growled, pacing before her. "You think you're clever, girl? You think you can defy me under my own roof?" Abeni's chest tightened. She had not aided them, not with words, not with actions. But she knew truth was a blade that never cut in her favor. She said nothing. Her silence was her only shield, but to Whitfield it was defiance. The whip cracked before she even braced herself. Pain exploded across her back, tearing open skin already scarred, again and again. Each lash stole her breath, but she clenched her teeth, forcing her body to remain upright. Blood ran down her legs, soaking into the dirt. "Beg," Whitfield spat, his voice sharp with venom. "And maybe I'll spare your miserable hide." Her lips parted, but no words came, would not give him the sound he craved. Her body might bow, but her spirit refused. The lashes grew wilder. The crowd of slaves watched in stricken silence, their eyes filled with horror, helpless to intervene. Some turned away. Others wept quietly. Finally, when her body could endure no more, Ebony collapsed into the soil. She lay there, breath shallow, blood pooling beneath her. Whitfield sneered down at her crumpled form. "Let her rot where she falls. Let them all see what happens when you forget your place." He turned and walked away, his boots leaving prints in the blood-soaked dirt. The others were ordered back to the fields. But when night fell and the overseers retreated, Maya slipped from the cabins. She found Ebony still lying where she had fallen, her breaths faint, her eyes barely open. Maya knelt beside her, cradling her head gently. "Stay with me, Maya," whispered, tears streaking her face. "Please don't leave me here alone." Ebony's lips moved, cracked and trembling. Her voice was only a breath, but the words were clear. "They cannot erase me." Her chest rose once more, then fell. The silence that followed was heavy, final. Maya bent over her, rocking her body as quiet sobs shook her frame. Then she began to hum the same song that had once filled the cabin, the same melody that had been beaten out of the boy in the fields. A song older than chains, a song of mourning, a song of defiance. The other slaves heard it in the distance, faint but strong, and their voices joined in whispers, carrying the tune on the night air. It wrapped around Ebony's still body, a shroud of love and rebellion. In the morning, there would be no grave for her, no marker, no name recorded in the master's ledgers. History would move on, erasing her as it had so many others. But in the hearts of those who sang, in the blood that soaked the earth, Ebony remained, not erased, eternal,